19-year-old.
Modernism was
very glad to be in Los Angeles right now as an art maker, as an artist.
I'm here in Eleebana in New South Wales, and today I'm in the studio of Andy Devine. And my first question to you, Andy, what was modernism?
Okay, modernism, or the definition of modernism to me, were that movement that was breaking for a brighter future and a better future at that. And what they were doing was they were embracing new emerging technology within the sciences, the mass production, and using that to build a better future. And also what they were also trying to do was they were breaking away from, or radically breaking away from that Victorian era, and using new modes of self-expressionism by using that technology, whether that be through architecture, through the arts, through literature, so on and so forth. The modernists were embracing the talent and the intellectual, the creativity and the radical thinking at that time, and they weren't sort of succumbing to the Victorian traditional ideals of that period. I think that was probably what my definition of modernism would be.
And when you are in the studio, do you think about that context? Or is that something that's beyond the scope of what you think about on a day-to-day basis?
No, I think using that mode of self-expressionism, I think for me is quite intrinsic in my work. Obviously from the UK, living in Australia, what I do is I try and take those two locations or those two worlds and merge them as one. And coming from an industrial background and living in Newcastle, which is also industrial, is just fodder for me. A lot of my paintings, which have that industrial setting, all of a personal narrative. So there is a self-expression within these paintings or within these assemblages that I do, or my prints, for example. So yeah, so people will see them as a landscape, an industrial landscape at that. But there's a little bit more to it. And I always see my paintings or my work as either chapters or pages of a book. And so I try and deal with past events from a background point of view. You know, growing up in the Thatcher era, which you'll probably be very aware of. You're also probably a milk monitor, just like me.
Was a career cut short?
Yes, very, very short. And yes, and even though she was the Minister of Education at one point. And so one person, Thatcher, made a huge impact on my life and my community and my family unit. Most of the males in my family worked in the steel or in the shipyards, for example. So, you know, when that became privatised, then that had a big impact both on myself and my family.
And you were in the north of England? North
of England, yeah. So probably about an hour south of Newcastle upon Tyne in a place called Middlesbrough.
Right.
So its main economy, well, I mean, iron ore being the bigger one. So, you know, steel works, chemical works, ICI and the like. So, you know, that sort of landscape was evident even at a very, very, very early age. You know, I can still remember when they used to pour the oxygen into the ladles of the steel, that the whole sky would pulsate red. And, you know, it would be a little bit like Mordor in a kind of way, you know, so you have this red oxide. And even as a kid, you'd have the radio in the background in bed, but you'd just be watching this ambient light in the background, and it was absolutely fascinating. Not knowing then obviously that will actually start to feed into my practice at a much, much later stage, you know. So it's quite interesting that small things, even that you haven't thought about for 20 to 30 years ago, start to come up to the surface and start to play a major part in your work, and especially in my work, you know. So yeah, I mean, I use it as a mechanism for a sort of a cathartic embrace in a kind of way, in a healing sense. This is why I paint. I don't paint to, you know, just purely just to sell the work, you know. I do it for the healing, as a healing process for me personally.
What was the effect of Thatcher's government when you were around in the 1980s in the UK? Because that obviously changed your life in many respects.
Yeah, it did. I mean, I knew what was going on. I was probably in my early teens at the time. I mean, she came in, what, 79 to 84?
79 to, yeah, well, she was first voted in 79 to 83.
83, okay. So, I mean, for me, that was my secondary schooling, that. So, you know, like I mentioned, you know, majority of the males in my family were in the steelworks. And I remember the strikes, and I remember there was periods of hardship. You know, not that I was actually totally conscious of it. It was a case of the mutterings in the kitchen, you know, about how they were going to make ends meet, basically. And, I remember my father being on strike for, you know, maybe 11, 15 weeks or something. Right. And so hence there was not, but that wasn't just my family unit. That was the whole street. You know, the whole area was in that. And there was a lot of anger, you know, an incredible amount of anger just through one person's or a government's reasoning for that, you know, just closure of everything, closure of the boatyards, the manufacturing, the production line, everything just stopped.
I think people who didn't live in the north, because I lived in that time in Wrexham in North Wales, which was a big mining town, and also had, like where you lived as well, big steelworks in Brumbo. We used to get something with the red glow in the sky at night. I think people who weren't living in those sort of places in the UK, who lived down south where there wasn't as much manufacturing industry, don't realise the damage that happened to the social fabric at that time. It really, really did. Really.
Yeah, that's right. It was, yeah, I mean, you know, it was a hard time. It was, but also saying that, it was also a time when the communities did come together. You know, it's a bit of a funny place, because yes, the communities are quite tight, but under hardship become even tighter still, and then they start to become a family unit. And I always remember there was a lot of sharing. You know, there was a, you know, it even sounds as if it was kind of like the post-war years, you know. But it, not to say that it was same, but it, you know, it wasn't overly too dissimilar of what the communities were actually doing. You know, and sharing, you know, whether it be Sunday lunches together, you know, and having, it wasn't unheard of having, you know, 4 or 5 families round at one particular house just to share that, you know, that particular day's meal, in which everybody would actually source something to share, you know. So it's a very friendly, probably not the right word, but probably a very friendly community, a very open community as well. And it's quite interesting coming to Newcastle, that because of that, heavy industry also spores that community also, which is obviously semi-lost now because of BHP closing down. But I would imagine in its heyday and towards the end of the BHP closing down, that it would have been fairly similar. You know, so you know, you come halfway across the world from one industrial town to another, and things are fairly similar. I mean, obviously the weather's better, but other than that, you know, it's very similar, very similar.
You mentioned before that rather than just landscapes, they are very dark, psychological landscapes, aren't they? Can you tell me a bit about what is happening within the darkness of your work?
Okay. Yeah, it sort of stems from a couple of reasons. I mean, these paintings actually start out in a red oxide, basically. Because that, again, that colour for me is memory. That colour is that sky at night. And because in my early teens, my parents divorced, and it was a fairly ugly time. You know, once you get over that initial Thatcherism and the closures, you know, getting over that one wave of tragedy, then another one starts to come about, and that's what basically happened. And so I think for me, and not being overly too, I mean, I knew what was going on, and I knew the family was breaking up, but I was in some sort of a bit of denial in a kind of way, because you know, that won't happen to my family, you know, it happens to others, but obviously it was quite a rough trot. And so because these paintings link back to that period of time, or the methodology does, I should say, not so much the imagery, but it's just the feeling that I get when I paint. I wouldn't say it's depression. It's something that I've got to source answers to these particular questions. Why did that happen? Why did they break up? I knew why they broke up, because there was a third element involved. You know, and you just kind of try and work these things out. And like I mentioned before, sometimes you come up with a question that you may not have thought about for 20 years. But then you start having conversations with these paintings and trying to work out what actually happened, you know, and try to sort of embed them into the paintings and try to resolve them if you possibly can, you know, and all those feelings start coming flooding back when you're 14, 15, you know, of all those, you know, dark times. But also, you know, I used to be a draftsman, so I'm very particular in preciseness, you know, and precision, and it's another way of actually hiding all that precise drawing underneath. You know, these paintings start out, as one person mentioned, they're not really paintings, they're more like drawings. Yeah. And I can probably agree to that. It's taken me a while to come around to it, but so I try and hide various questions that I don't really want people to know, you know, so that's why they're fairly dark. I want people to also be drawn into them, but also have this period where they're looking at the work, but it's become a bit uneasy being where they are and viewing what they view. It's somewhere that they don't necessarily want to be, you know, so these landscapes tend to be fairly desolate. And I get abandoned. Yeah. Well, you know, it's also harking back to that period when Thatcher started closing everything down, and you know, you would walk down one particular area which was absolutely thriving a couple of months ago, and now it's totally desolate. Yeah. You know, and nothing is actually going to happen there anymore. And this is what these sort of paintings, you know, so there's a combination of a lot of things, you know, whether it be family, whether it be political, not that they're political paintings, but there's definitely a political element to it, in that one being that, you know, the Conservative Party, so. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, so it's, I mean, I met my father for the first time in 25 years. There would be no contact whatsoever. And so a couple of years ago, I met up with him. I went back to the UK and tried to source information from him of what happened and why it happened. You know, there's an immense amount of anger there. And I think because of that absence of father, an absence of relationship, I think the darkness for me is absence. And I think that's what I draw upon, is not having that connection with him. And even in the meeting that I had with him, which my mum didn't know anything about, that he was still in denial, still after all these years. And I think, you know, when I was going through a period at the university where I felt that he had the key to open up this door, to open up my practice further, I think I came to the realization that it wasn't that at all. It wasn't him, it was me. And so I came away from that meeting halfway through going, it doesn't really matter what he says now, because he's still in denial. He's still going to continue to lie to me. So, yeah, that was probably the last time I saw him. And so I knew then I would never see him again. But I think that absence, I think, going back to the question, why is it dark? I think it's the absence of father, I think. You know, I had this romantic notion of meeting him again, and for him to be that father that when he left, I had this, because I was only, you know, like I say, in my mid-teens, so, It was a case of, I felt he was an intelligent man. I felt he was a strong personality. And all of those things that you see in a father. And then when I met up with him, he wasn't. He wasn't as intelligent as I imagined, you know. And he wasn't strong. And yes, there was that gap between us, you know. And it was quite an interesting beginning of a conversation with him. And I suddenly then realised, well, I've come a fair way, you know, just through the education that I've had. I wouldn't say that it was a great education right at the beginning when I was at secondary school, but I think I realised that it was pretty important at a much later stage, going back to university. But yes, it was quite an interesting meet. But like you say, it sort of dampened the whole of that romanticism that I had for him, and that, you know, that connection.
Did it change your work after that point? Because that was only fairly recently, wasn't it?
That was 2009-10.
Yeah.
So the winter of. Well, yeah, it did, you know, because when I was doing the paintings for my masters in 2010-11, there was a huge amount of anger, huge amount, you know, that this guy just betrayed me totally and utterly. And so when I was painting these things, they had a huge grasp and a huge draw, you know, because I wanted to discover for myself, with the conversations that I was having internally and externally because of the paintings, that when I met up with him and nothing really mattered anymore, and obviously being a father now, the anger subsided greatly. But you know what? I think now the paintings are not as strong as they once were because they don't have that nastiness that was running in my head, you know.
Do you think that's just your perception of your paintings now, or have other people commented on that?
No, I think it's me. You know, people see them for what they are, and they see them as industrial settings. And obviously being in Newcastle, in an industrial landscape, you know, I get many people saying to me, I know where that location is, but yet really what it is it's two locations merged as one to form one painting. And I choose whatever I choose as signifiers for this cathartic journey.
To me they seem to be, and I think this is maybe my reading is based on having grown up in a similar place, where I remember these kinds of landscapes as well from when I was a teenager in the UK, but they seem to me landscapes that are about estrangement, because during the daytime they're fairly kind of mundane places, really, aren't they? These industrial landscapes, they're full of people who work in there, but at night they become these unregulated, abandoned zones that
doesn't have that hive of activity anymore.
Yeah.
See, I see them slightly differently.
Yeah.
Slightly differently, and what I see them as, I see them during the day as this male figure, this big brash male figure. He's there on the landscape, and then at night, it turns quite feminine because of all the glitter, the lights, you know, the feminine. They just look very feminine to me, you know. Look like a little bit like a peacock showing off their feathers, you know, trying to entice, you know. So, and I always maintain that, you know, that switch between male to female, depending on the day. You know, I always remember when I lived in London, and when I used to get the bus, being a student, because I couldn't afford the train, getting the bus up to Middlesbrough, which was a 5-hour trek, you would get to a certain point, and all of a sudden you just see this horizon line, and it would stretch for miles, and it looked like a fallen Christmas tree. And what it basically was the industrial landscape. And as soon as you saw that, you knew it was home, you know. So even now, you know, when I drive past Ganninans in the city here, and there's that certain coloration against the, you know, the factory walls, for example, this beautiful orange. And it just where you go, it just means, you know, it just has a lovely romance to it, you know.
So there is a kind of level of, because these are memory landscapes, really, aren't they?
Yes.
And there is a degree of nostalgia to these as well.
Yes.
Estrangement, I think.
Yes. Yes. I mean, obviously, a lot of them abandoned warehouses, and I feel like that sort of abandonment, which obviously happened, you know. And so, you know, sometimes I portray myself, you know, as these structures in this, you know, desolate landscape, which is, you know, has unhealed itself in some strange way, just through a course of events, you know. So I do see myself in these, you know, probably not. I mean, this last wave of paintings didn't have the same sense of anger towards anybody, but I think they've come out okay. I think they might be maybe a little bit too romantic,
right?
But people like that. So
you think that since after this meeting with your father, there's been almost like a mellowing of the attitude behind it?
Yeah, I think so.
An aesthetic.
I think that's right, because, you know, he was the crux. I felt he held answers to questions, and in a sense he didn't. And so with that, it was a case of, well, if you can't help me for my personal worth, then we'll let bygones be bygones. But obviously now being a dad, there's other things to concentrate on now, you know, having obviously 2 small ones, and, you know, and trying, well, will not go down the same path that he did, you know, because, you know, you can't fathom, you know, the repercussions, or maybe you can, the repercussions of what actually happens through one person's actions.
I think often that person can't fathom.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know, and it's not just, you know, the siblings. You know, it's the whole entire family unit. Somewhere, you know, even the grandmother would feel some sort of, you know, abandonment of some description. You know, so it's got this amazing snowballing effect. You know, but, you know, for me, in those sort of early days of my practice, you know, has been a wealth of information and a wealth of searching, you know. So
the idea of catharsis is one that is really about healing, isn't it? Has the process of producing this work helped? Has it healed?
Well, I think sorry, I think it has, because, you know, that anger that once was there, and, you know, it raised its head in many ugly ways, has now sort of subsided now, you know. And I'm quite happy with myself now that I've actually, you know, faced this guy and, you know, posed questions to him which he either denied or skirted around. And I think, you know, and it always harked back to me that, you know, they always implemented into me, honesty is the best policy, you know, on a daily basis. And yet, if they can't practice what they preach, then, you know, I don't really have a great deal of respect for them anymore, you know. So I think, yes, it has. The anger's not there anymore. There's a few questions that need to be answered and sorted out, but not to the same extent of what it once was.
And you also produce 3-dimensional works?
Yes, I do, yeah.
So what are the... Because I'm not familiar with your 3D works.
Well, I've made installations, for example. I did a large installation with my master's work, which was titled Embrace a Sense of Place. And basically what that was when I was at home, 2009, 2010, and there was so much... I was only there for maybe 4 weeks, and I had to obviously meet him, see the family that I hadn't seen for 6 years, and... you know what it's like. Sometimes you get home, you're there for a couple of days, and you just want to leave, you know. It's just, this is enough. But there was so much information, you know, because they hadn't seen myself and Kerry and Josie for, you know, for that period of time. So it was a case of, you know, we want you, and they would dragged us here, there, and everywhere. And then obviously the emotional journey that I had with meeting him and the questions that I would have, and then to throw another curveball. The winter was horrific. You know, it was one of the worst winters on record. So I'd actually chosen a location that I knew that if things got a little bit too heavy, that I could actually escape and go, bye, I'm off. Well, that changed. And I'm going, right, okay, what's plan B? And then an uncle of mine said, well, why don't we go here? And it was actually called the Black Sheep. of all places. And it was in this very isolated area outside Middlesbrough, in a very rural area. And we met, I got there and the pub was closed. And I've just gone, this is, you know, it was just a comedy of errors. Then I tried to phone an uncle of mine to see where he was at, so I could compose myself. And I made my way around the pub and I saw this guy walking towards me. And all of a sudden I went, what's my grandfather doing here? And obviously my grandfather's been dead for quite some time, but it was my father who'd actually metamorphosized himself into my grandfather. I just couldn't, you know, so I was on the back foot somewhat. So yeah, so a whole series of events happened that shouldn't have done, you know, but having to just to sort of to deal with it there and then, yeah.
So we were talking about the 3D work.
Oh, sorry, 3D work.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
So basically, so what I did was I needed to get out of Middlesbrough, and one of the places I love going is Anthony Gormley's sculpture of the Angel of the North. And so we drove up there. The weather was horrific. It was cold. It was wet. It was snowing, and we got there. And do you know what? It's been the first time. The first time I've ever been emotional in front of a piece of work. People get emotional in paintings, but because I hadn't seen this structure for such a long time, and because it has this embracing feeling and the enormity of it all, I thought I've got to use this in some form in my artwork when I get back. So I wanted the exhibition to be traditional, i.e. the paintings, and contemporary being, in this case, an installation. So what I chose some metal plates, because that's the economy of my hometown, steel, mild steel. Then I wanted to use an oxidant on that which would rust, so decay of the landscape, decay of family unit, decay of relationships. And what I did was I silk screened 5 characters, 4 family members plus 1, and I silk screened statements, dates of birth, any information that would locate that particular character, myself, my mum, my sister, for example, my dad. And I used those plates as a ground, and then what I did was I actually formatted those into a T-square, just being influenced by Colin McCann, the New Zealand artist, and I actually put in a stencil of the Angel of the North in coal, because the Angel of the North is actually on the foundations of an old mine. But this installation was 6 meters by 4 meters long, so it was fairly hefty, but also it was pointing north. So I just needed that to be a symbol of conversation and landscape, just as all that conversation I was having in my head when I went to go and see the Angel of the North. But I think that was probably one of the most embracing feelings that I've had, you know, in front of an artwork. So thank you, Mr. Gormley.
It's interesting because it's a male figure as well, isn't it?
Well, male figure, female figure. Well, yes, it is. It's a male figure. But you know, when that was first put up, it was just not liked at all. But now has become, you know, a guardian of the Northeast now. You know, people really do embrace it and are proud of it. You know,
it's funny because I think people responded negatively to the fact that it is a very heavy industrial,
structure.
Yeah.
But it was all made in Hartlepool, so you know, and sourced from Corten Steel. So I think that was another local manufactured material. So it was all sort of sourced from that. So yeah, it was a beautiful day, even though the weather was not. But I think, you know, just give a bit of clarity that day, a lot of clarity.